Hello, everyone. This is Andy Skidmore. Thank you for your time today. We're going to discuss a little bit about dairy growth standards and how to achieve them. And I'll jump right into it. So our agenda today is we're going to talk first a little bit about feed requirements for a calf. And then, our overall objective is to develop a calf into a good herd replacement as soon as possible. We know time is equal to money, and if we can bring them into the herd sooner, that's very cost effective for the producer. So growth is very important in being able to do that. So we're going to look a little bit about the effect of growth, especially in this pre-weaning time period. That will be our focus today. But there's a very big impact on future productivity. So as you see down here, my little balance thing right here, that we've got to somehow balance our cost with the time. So if we can decrease our time without too much cost, then we're winning and we've got these two in balance. So then the second part of our agenda today will be how do we meet these objectives that we set up here in growth and health of our calves. So in the United States, there's a Dairy Calf and Heifer Association, and for a number of years they have established gold standards for raising calves, and they're on their third edition now. But these are continually updated as new research and information becomes available to establish parameters or objectives and goals in developing heifers such that they might be able to become productive herd. So if we look at the objective that they have set for growth, that objective is to at least double birth weight to weaning at 56 days of age. So in other words, whatever the birth weight is, we want to double it within 2 months time period. So let's take a look here and see what that looks like. So if we have here a calf that's born, that's 36 kilos, we want to double that, then that's going to be 72 kilos in 2 months would be the final birth weight, or not birth weight, weaning weight of those calves right there. So if we look at that, we translate that into how much is that per day. So if we have 32 kilograms, because we had 36 kilos here birth weight, and we got 36 kilos that we want to gain in those 2 months, and you do that simple math, and you get 643 grams per day is how much those calves should be growing during that time period. So if we look at that, if we assume an 83% efficiency rate of nutrient utilization from milk, it's a very high efficiency rate, but that's what the literature would indicate for milk. Starter grain is totally different. But that 643 grams per day that we've got to gain and an 83% efficiency rate, that means that we have to deliver 775 grams of dry matter nutrients to the calf per day in order to double that birth weight. So if we look at that, if milk is 12.5% solids, then 775 grams of dry matter divided by that 12.5% solids means that we need to be feeding at least 6 liters of milk every day. And so that's what's being required, is 6 liters in order to meet this goal right here. So that's a lot more milk than what I'm being told is being fed in Korea. But let's look at this at a different birth weight. If this birth weight was a little bit bigger, which is not unusual for today's Holsteins, of 42 kilograms, and we multiply that, that means that at the end of 2 months, they should be weighing 84 kilos in there. And if we do the same simple math that we did before, we look at the 42 kilograms divided by 56 days. That equals 750 grams per day is what they should be growing as an average from 0 to 56 days. So again, if we do the same math, 750 grams and 83% efficiency of nutrient utilization, that means they should be gaining 900 grams, or we should be feeding 900 grams of dry matter per day to those calves. And if we assume again the 12.5% solids, which is normal for milk, then that means we need to be feeding just over 7 liters of milk every day in order to get the calves to grow this, to meet the gold standard set by the Dairy Calf and Heifer Association in the United States. Now let's look at the Korean experience. This is the data that I was given. So on average, in Korea, calves are fed 400 to 500 grams of dry matter per calf per day in milk. So if we trying to achieve the 775 grams of dry matter required per day, and we look at just the middle value here, 450 grams being fed per day, that means we are short 325 grams of dry matter intake per calf per day. And this is all missed growth opportunity in here. So let's assume then that they have a little bit bigger calf. If we assume a 42 kilo birth weight, then if you subtract this 450 grams that's being fed every day, then we're short 458 grams of dry matter intake per calf per day, and it's all missed growth opportunity. So there's huge opportunity in Korea to meet the growth standards as been established in the United States. Let's just look here what milk yield response is due to a higher plane of nutrition in that pre-weaning period when they're being fed milk or milk replacer. So this is a summary of 14 different studies that have been reported in the peer-reviewed literature looking at the impact of nutrition in that pre-weaning stage. So you can see values here from 30 years ago of 1,400 kilograms difference in first lactation milk just due to increase in the plane of nutrition in that pre-weaning period. And so that's a real high one. More common down here as you scan down through here is the 500, 600 kilograms of milk in first lactation. There are 2 studies here that reported no difference, but if you look at that, they didn't see a difference in growth rates either. So they were not achieving that growth standard that has been established of doubling birth weight in the first 2 months of age. And so the same thing in this one right here. So let's look at that if we combine all of those. And this is a meta-analysis that was published by Fernando Soberón and Mike Van Amberg in 2013. It's almost 10 years ago. But they took those first 12 studies as they were established there or published. The last 2 were not published in time for this review. So, but if you look at the difference between first lactation milk yield of those calves that were on a higher plane of nutrition versus a lower plane of nutrition, on average, they gave 435 kilograms more milk just due to the higher plane of nutrition before weaning. And if you look at the confidence interval in there, you can see a low value of 205, upper limit of 664. So somewhere in between there is where you're going to land if you improve the nutrition in the calf before weaning. And so they also looked at it as an odds ratio. So the odds ratio is 2. What that means is that a calf on a higher plane of nutrition during the milk feeding period is twice as likely to give more milk during first lactation. So that's pretty good odds. That's a pretty good return, if you ask me, of, more milk in first lactation, and, pretty good odds there, 2 to 1, of that actually happening by feeding a little bit more milk. So let's look at here for a second at milk versus milk replacer. And I just want to point out a couple things here. But typically milk is 3.8% fat. It could be higher, it could be lower, depending on the herd. Protein around 3.2%. If you look at total solids, that's going to be about 12.5%. So let's look at milk on a dry matter basis. This is on an as-fed basis right here. This is on an as-fed basis. We convert that to a dry matter basis. We can see fat is 30%, protein's about 25, 26%. Now, if we look at milk replacer, and over the years, I've collected a whole stack of different milk replacer labels as I visit farms and visit the calf raising areas. And those milk replacers will average somewhere between 15 and 30% fat and 20 to 28% protein. So they're all over the board on that. For our faster growing calves, in my opinion, we need to be closer to that 28%, somewhere 25, 28%. And the protein can be, I think it needs to be, or fat, sorry. Fat needs to be somewhere between that 18 to 22%, somewhere in the middle of this range that's here. So, and I don't have time today to go into why I recommend that, but due to our faster growing rates and to be closer to what our values are on milk on a dry matter basis, so somewhere to get closer to that. I don't think we need those real high fat milk replacers. There certainly needs to be some fat in there, but then a little bit higher protein than what's normally fed most of our milk replacers. So that has a big impact on growth. I like this quote. This is from, 25 years ago, but she published in the Hordes Dairyman there. And I've always kept this because I think it's very important. But assuming that anyone can successfully raise healthy calves is as costly as assuming the end is closed on the bulk tank. Now, to me, I've been guilty of that when I was milking cows, of forgetting to close the bulk tank before they started milking after cleaning it. Then all the milk runs down the drain. But I think here, assuming that everybody can raise calves, it's simple and easy to do, is a fallacy. It's not true. And we have to pick our battles and pick those who can have the ability to raise good calves too. I just throw that in there. Okay, so let's look here at the effects of limited nutrition on calf growth. This is a really nice study that was published 6-7 years ago here. And the treatments here, these are important. You'll see this again and again throughout the rest of this presentation. But the treatments are a low plane of nutrition. So in those calves, they got 409 grams of milk replacer. It's a 20-20 milk replacer, so it's 20% protein, 20% fat. And they delivered a total of 4 liters and divided that into 2 equal feedings per day. The high plane of nutrition then was 610 grams for 10 days, and then 735 grams from day 10 to day 42, and it's a 28% protein milk replacer with 25% fat. And these are Jersey calves. So typically, a lot of times we'll feed a little more fat to Jersey calves. But it was in the milk replacer, again, divided into 2 feedings per day of either 5 liters in the first 10 days or 6 liters in the rest of the days to age 42. Now that 42 days will come important later. But let's look at these calves. Birth weights, 24, 25 kilos. So these are much smaller calves than what I was showing earlier. Again, these are Jersey calves. But look at this birth or final body weight at the end of 77 days. So again, that's 11 weeks rather than looking at 7 or 8 weeks. So it's a little more time period, but they more than doubled those birth weights. This one's not quite double, but within that standard, the high plane nutrition met that gold standard as established by the Dairy Calf and Heifer Association in the United States. Let's look at growth rates. So again here, these are the calves that were getting the 400 grams a day on the low plane of nutrition. So during the time they were on milk, they were gaining almost 300 grams per day. And you look at the high plane nutrition, they were gaining almost 500 grams per day. Now this is important when you look at these 25 kilo calves and they're feeding 5 and 6 liters per day into 2 feedings. So can it be done? Yes, it can be done, and they will eat it. Don't need to worry about that. Some people try and tell us, oh, they won't eat that much. Yes, they will. So this is the post-weaning period. And, you know, in this study, they were doing some other things post-weaning. But post-weaning, there was no difference in growth rates. Statistically, those are exactly the same. But look down here at the feed to gain ratio. Again, this is just during that time period on milk. So if you've got a feed to gain ratio here of 2, and here it's 1.5, that means that these animals on the high calves, on the high plane of nutrition, they were able to grow a kilo on a ½ kilo less feed. Let me try and say that again to make sure you understand that. That the amount of grain, or not grain, this is milk, amount of milk required to gain a kilo of body weight was ½ kilo less in the high plane of nutrition. So hopefully that made sense to you. So the feed efficiency is tremendous. It's 25% greater for those on the high plane of nutrition. So you talk about cost effectiveness. I mean, that's what it's all about. Is getting efficiency gain. So again, another thing here, the effects of limited nutrition on calf health and growth. So we looked at growth there a minute ago, but we look at the immune development and immune response. It's a very energy expensive process. So we forget about that. We all focus on growth, but the immune development, immune response is a very expensive process. So what that means then is energy is limiting and the health of the calf is compromised. No energy to respond to an illness event. So in other words, if the animal or the calf is exposed to some type of pathogen, it has no energy to respond to it, so therefore it gets sick. So let me demonstrate that here in this next slide. Again, this is the same study as before. And what they did at day 42 is they took 10 calves out of each treatment. So you can see right here, 10 calves per treatment. And they challenged them to salmonella. and then looked at what the response was. So we look at morbidity, which is how many of them got sick. So on the low plane of nutrition, we can see here that half the calves got sick. On the high plane of nutrition, only a quarter or 25%, less than 25% of the calves got sick. Now this is when they actually gave them salmonella. You can see the p-value is fairly high, meaning statistically there's no difference there, but that's because there's only 10 calves per treatment, and there's not enough power to statistically say there's a difference. From field experience, we see much greater responses. The high plane of nutrition can drop pneumonia rates from 35% to 5% in calves. That's what we see in the field. Again, we got a lot more than 10 calves in there, but that's still a significant drop because they have the energy to respond to a challenge, whether it's salmonella or it's E. coli or whatever. They have the energy to respond, the immune system can respond, and so we see much less illness or sickness in those calves on the high plane of nutrition. So this is a different study. And this one's looking at it a little bit differently. This is in lambs, so it's not calves, but the principle is the same. So we've got on 100% energy, we've got these open squares is at 80% of required energy, and here's the 70% of required energy. Now, if you remember back to where I talked about the Korean experience, where our nutrient levels are close to half, or probably closer to the 70% of what we would require in a higher plane of nutrition. So in these lambs here, what they did, time zero is when they vaccinated the lambs. And this absorbance then is a measurement of the amount of antibodies, in response to that particular vaccine. So we can see here, 7 days after vaccination, we look at the response in antibody levels that the ones on the high plane of nutrition, that would be these right here, respond on antibody levels much higher than those down here on the 70% of energy requirement. So we can see out here 14, 21 days, it's not a whole lot different between the energy requirement, but in this first week of life, and so when do calves get sick? It's down here in this age range, even though this is day. These are young lambs, but this is day from vaccination. So it's another illustration of energy required in the immune response. So how do we make this happen? How do we reach this gold standard? We didn't talk about colostrum today, but colostrum is essential. A high quality colostrum in an adequate quantity within 6 hours of birth would be the gold standard there, and getting that colostrum in them. If we don't get them in there, we're not likely to achieve survivability or the growth parameters that we want to achieve. So that's number one. Number two, we got to feed more milk, as we've illustrated previously here. So feeding 3+ kilograms twice a day or 2+ kilograms 3 times a day, it doesn't matter which strategy you implement here. What matters is we get the dry matter intakes in them that what we need. So another important one that we haven't discussed, ad libitum water at all times. Even though these calves are being fed much greater amounts of milk, we got to have water there for them at all times. You'll be amazed at how much water they will drink. Now this is very important. I'll show you in a few minutes how important this is in dry matter intakes on these calves. But they've got to have water even though we're feeding large volumes of milk. And we start feeding grain at 2 to 3 weeks of age in order to get them who started on grain at these higher feeding rates, they will not start as soon. I'll show you that in a minute, but they will start eating grain, and we've got to have that so that we can get them weaned. So let's look at some of these myths about feeding more milk. So I've listed 6 of them here. Feeding more milk will cause diarrhea. Feeding more milk costs too much money. They're drinking a lot of milk. There's no need for additional water. Manure is more loose than water. It requires more bedding. Takes more labor. Rumen development is delayed. Okay, so let's look at these myths. We're going to take them one at a time here. So feeding more milk will cause diarrhea. Again, we go back to the same study that we had before. It was done with the high plane of nutrition and the low plane of nutrition. And they recorded fecal scores every day. So on a scale of 1 to 5, how much or how loose was the manure on these calves? And they would give it a score of, 1 being very stiff, a 5 being very watery. And so if we look at that and we look at these scores here, this would be the incidence of what was considered a high score on these calves. And if we look on the low plane of nutrition versus a high plane of nutrition, we've got almost 90% incidence rates of high fecal scores, or in other words, more watery diarrhea. And it's a very significant difference. We look at the duration of each episode. So the high plane of nutrition, it is much higher. So when we feed this higher plane of nutrition, we can expect watery diarrhea and long durations or bouts of watery diarrhea or watery fecal scores, I should say. Technically, it's not diarrhea because it's not pathogen associated. So you feed a lot more volume, you're going to get more watery fecal scores or fecal matter there. But we look at that. High fecal scores or higher fecal scores do not equal higher disease. So that's one thing you've got to get used to, is seeing more watery diarrhea. So you've got to watch those calves, because the difference between a high fecal score and pathogenic diarrhea is small. It's much smaller than it is on a low plane of nutrition. So got to have somebody watching those calves every day. And I don't have time to go into all the management things there, but the calves with the dirty tails and depressed, those are sick calves. If they're bright-eyed and hopping around, even though they may have a loose manure, then there's no problems with them and they don't need to be treated. So good sanitation is also essential, because milk is a great media for growing bacteria. So if our sanitation is not optimum, then we're just going to be feeding the bacteria instead of the calf, and the calf's going to get sick. So feeding more milk does not necessarily cause diarrhea. Okay, let's look at myth number 2. Feeding more milk costs too much money. That's an argument we often get, especially when we started this in the United States. People would think it costs too much. But if you look at the efficiency of growth, which I showed you earlier. So, well, let me go down the list here. So milk replacer, if I'm going to feed twice as much, it's going to cost me twice as much. And so there yes, it will cost you more milk replacer, but the returns are much greater than the milk replacer that you're putting into the calf. So let's look at that. Disease treatment, it's going to be at least half of what it was before on a lower plane of nutrition. So if we can cut our treatments and labor to treat them, and make your calf feeders a whole lot happier, because it decreases the amount of work and the emotional drain of treating sick calves. We look at the feed efficiency or feed to gain ratio. We've got a ½ kilo less feed per kilogram of gain when we're feeding twice as much milk replacer. So to me, that's a tremendous trade-off. I can get my cost of gain is much lower. My cost per day is going to be much higher because I'm feeding twice as much there. Okay, the milk yield increase I showed you, review on 12 papers. The average response there was 435 kilos in first lactation. That's in first lactation alone. So labor, whether that goes up or down, that all depends on your strategy of feeding. If you're going to feed twice a day, then I don't see it as being that much more labor. You've got the decrease in labor for disease treatment, so added into that. If you're going to add an extra feeding and go 3x feeding, then yeah, there's going to be a little bit more labor in it. Bedding costs, yes, they will increase. So bedding does increase. I didn't put values in here because I have no idea what those values are in Korea in there, but these are the areas you can put in your own values. But to me, there's a tremendous benefit, and that's why most or almost all of our progressive and higher producing herds in the United States are trying to achieve that goal of doubling the birth weight in the first 2 months of age, because they see the benefit from it. So myth number 3 here, they're drinking a lot of milk, therefore there's no need for additional water. Well, this goes back a long time here looking at this data, but it's very important data here to look at, and it still applies when we're feeding twice as much milk replacer to the calves. So if you look at the blue line here, and this is a 4-week study looking at no water, additional water being added to, and we look at what starter intakes are, you can see these starter intakes are much lower on the ones with no water than these calves here with the ad lib water. In other words, water-free choice in there. So starter intake was much higher in these calves. And that's important because we've got to develop the rumen and get them on the dry feed. And so with water, higher dry matter intake or higher starter intake. And the analogy I like to use there is that try eating a bunch of crackers and have nothing to drink with them. So those dry crackers, they get very hard to eat, very many of them, without having something to drink. And that's just what these calves go through. There's no additional water to wash down that starter grain. They're not going to eat very much. They'll eat enough just to keep them alive, but they're not going to eat. And you see the difference between these two lines here. So if we look at weight gain, as that starter intake starts to come up, here again, the no water calves are way down here. And the calves that got water, in addition to the milk replacer that they were getting, you can see that they have a much higher rate of gain, rate of gain here. So they gain a lot more, they grow a lot more, their rumen develops a lot faster, and they do much better if they have free choice water. And so we recommend that free choice water independent of how much milk replacer you're feeding. It's very important. But if you're feeding twice as much milk replacer, it's even more important that they have free choice water available to them. So myth number 4, manure is more loose or watery and requires more bedding. Higher fecal scores, this is absolutely correct. So you can see the fecal scores again from that same study before. So more bedding is required to keep the calves dry. Calves must be kept dry. If they get wet, then their maintenance requirement skyrockets and you will not see the growth and response. So anybody that implements this is going to be required to apply more bedding to the calves. Myth number 5, it takes more labor to feed more milk. We talked about that a little bit before. Frequency of feeding, 2x versus 3x feeding. That's where a big labor increase might occur. Look at disease treatment. It's reduced so that there's not near as much disease to treat, the labor, the medicine, everything else there to treat these calves. Bedding, yes, that increases, so that's a labor difference there, not only the cost of the bedding, but also the cost of the bedding itself. Feed mixing and delivery, I don't think that'll be any change. But this is, I mean, here's your big places where your labor is. There are things that are done every day or more than once a day. Those are the things that are going to be different in labor, and it could either go up or stay the same or may even go down because of this reduced disease treatment. So rumen development is delayed. Again, this is the data from this particular study that we've been following through here. We look at these average daily gains I showed you before when they were on milk. So yeah, there's a big significant difference here on the higher plane of nutrition. If we look at this post-weaning period, this 3 weeks here, the difference in the gains here are not different. So post-weaning, they gained the same, being offered the same amount of feed as what they did in the low plane of nutrition and the high plane of nutrition. When we look at feed to gain ratios on the milk, we saw a ½ kilo difference here in the amount of feed required to gain a kilo of milk or a kilo of growth. And so here the feed to gain ratio in that post-weaning period, you can see that it is even, it's even greater than the ½ kilo. Very significant difference. So again, that feed efficiency follows through post-weaning to where we've got a very efficient growing calf in there. And the starter intakes are lower. That's what leads to that efficiency, because we can get the same growth with less feed. That increases feed efficiency here. And so the high plane of nutrition, I mean, you can't do that without a functioning rumen to get a higher efficiency at the same growth rate as those that were raised on a low plane of nutrition during the milk feeding phase. So again, this is that same study once again. So what they did with those calves, as I explained earlier, was the Salmonella challenge. So this 0 line, this vertical line right here, is when they gave the calves Salmonella. So we go back here, this period would have been they still on milk. And we look at what our starter intakes here did after the challenge with Salmonella on these 10 calves. So these open circles here, these are the ones that were on the higher plane of nutrition. You can see that their dry matter intake and calf starter increased much more than the calves that were on the low plane of nutrition. So we get this rumen development, even in the face of a Salmonella challenge, it's much greater on those on the high plane of nutrition. So they're able to respond much better, much greater. So the myths, just review those real quick. Feeding more milk will cause diarrhea. We busted that myth. Feeding more milk costs too much money. We busted that myth. They are drinking a lot of milk, therefore there is no need for additional water. Busted that one. They've got to have water in there. Manure is more loose or watery and requires more bedding. Absolutely, that's going to happen. It takes more labor. That could go either way, depending on how you implement that. And what happens there. Rumen development is delayed. We busted that myth as well. So in summary, feed more milk to the calves in order to achieve more healthy and better developed calves for future milk production. So thank you for your time, and hopefully there's questions and discussion.